The room was quiet, save for the steady tick of the grandfather clock, counting down the moments of Thomas Garrick's decision. His pen hovered over the line on the legal document that would alter his legacy forever. Thomas, a man of immense wealth but little warmth in his personal life, had carefully orchestrated the end of his financial empire. And now, with this signature, he was about to give it all away. The last few years had been heavy with loneliness and regrets that seemed to increase with each passing day. Decades ago, he had built an empire, believing that it would bring him a sense of satisfaction and control. But as the years slipped by, he found that all his riches couldn't provide what he truly craved: a family. Thomas had never married, never had children. Now, nearing 70, he felt a persistent, hollow ache that no amount of money could fill. He thought of the things he had gained and lost in his life, but now, all that was left was an unquenchable void. 2 months ago, an article had caught his attention. It was about an orphanage struggling to keep its doors open due to lack of funding. The photo accompanying the article had shown a group of children huddled together in a small, bleak room. They wore clothes too big or too small, yet their faces were lit up with smiles as they looked out from the page. Something in their innocence struck him. He felt an unfamiliar sense of purpose stir within him. His wealth had felt like a curse in recent years, but now it could serve as a lifeline for these children who had nothing. The decision had been both simple and profound. He would donate his entire fortune anonymously to that orphanage, ensuring they would never want for anything again. Once he had made his choice, he was consumed by a strange calm, as if he had finally aligned with a purpose he had avoided for too long. With a steady hand, he signed his name on the final line, then set the pen down. In that moment, he was no longer Thomas Garrick, billionaire entrepreneur and tycoon. He was simply Thomas, a man hoping to leave something good in the world. The papers were swiftly taken by his lawyer, sealed and certified, making the transfer irreversible. The following morning, Thomas awoke with an uncharacteristic sense of excitement. He would visit the orphanage himself, under the guise of a simple donor, to witness firsthand the lives he would be changing. He hadn't set foot in an orphanage since he was a young man, back when his own father had taken him to donate in the hopes of instilling a sense of charity. He remembered the experience as daunting and cold, and the memory made him shudder. But today, Thomas had a sense of purpose that brightened the room around him as he dressed in his simplest clothes, choosing a quiet but polished ensemble that would attract as little attention as possible. The drive to the orphanage was filled with a quiet anticipation. For years, he'd traveled in luxury, but today he took a modest car, one of the few he still kept in his garage for errands. As he navigated the unfamiliar streets leading to the orphanage, he noticed the neighborhoods becoming shabbier, the houses smaller, and the sidewalks in various states of disrepair. It was a part of the city he hadn't visited in decades, a stark contrast to the wealthier districts he had come to know so well. Finally, he pulled up to a modest brick building with faded paint and a rusty iron gate. The orphanage was a squat structure with small windows and a plain sign that read, "St. Mary's Home for Children." The place looked even more worn and weary than it had in the photo, and he felt an intense urge to make sure his contribution would help transform it entirely. As he stepped out of his car, a faint sense of unease gripped him. Would they recognize him? Would they be suspicious of his intentions? He was greeted at the door by a kind-eyed woman in her 50s, dressed in a cardigan and skirt, her hair pulled back in a sensible bun. She introduced herself as Mrs. Harper, the director of the orphanage. Her demeanor was warm, and her voice had a calm, measured quality that made Thomas feel oddly at ease. "Good morning, sir. I hear you've come to see our little sanctuary?" she asked, her eyes crinkling with a genuine smile. "Yes, indeed. I wanted to meet the children," he replied, returning her smile as best as he could, though he felt slightly awkward. He wasn't used to smiling so openly, nor was he accustomed to meeting people who didn't know him by reputation. It was oddly refreshing. Mrs. Harper led him down a narrow hallway that echoed with faint laughter and voices coming from a nearby room. As they reached the playroom, the sounds grew louder, and Thomas caught his first glimpse of the children who lived there. They were playing with worn-out toys, some reading ragged books, and others drawing pictures on scraps of paper. Each child seemed fully absorbed in their small world, oblivious to the man observing them from the doorway. It was then that he noticed a young boy standing apart from the rest. The child had a mop of unruly auburn hair and piercing blue eyes, and he was quietly arranging a row of small toys on a shelf. For a moment, Thomas's heart skipped a beat. The boy reminded him so strikingly of his own father in his youth. It was as if he were looking at a ghost from his past. The resemblance was uncanny. The same solemn expression, the same set to his jaw, even the same slight furrow between his brows that his father used to have when deep in thought. Unable to look away, Thomas felt a strange, inexplicable connection to the boy. He asked Mrs. Harper, "Who is that child?" "Oh, that's Oliver," she replied, her gaze softening as she looked at the boy. "He's a quiet one, that one. Came to us a few years ago. Just appeared on our doorstep, no note or anything. We never could trace his family." Thomas felt a jolt, an emotion he couldn't quite name. His father had also been orphaned, raised in the care of relatives before building the Garrick Empire. The resemblance, the story, it all seemed too surreal to be mere coincidence. As they continued the tour, Thomas's thoughts were fixed on Oliver, a gnawing sense of familiarity intertwining with the bewilderment he felt. Could this child be connected to his own family in some way? And even if he wasn't, what did it mean that he felt such a bond with him? With his fortune already set to help the orphanage, Thomas hadn't expected anything in return. Yet, standing there, he sensed that perhaps his decision to come today had unearthed something far more profound, a connection he never anticipated, one that had the power to reshape his life in ways he had yet to understand. The days following Thomas's first visit to St. Mary's were marked by a rare, restless energy that seemed to defy reason. He was a man known for measured decisions, one who operated with precision and calm. But after seeing Oliver, something had shifted in him. The boy's face lingered in his mind, a face so familiar yet impossible, bringing him back to memories he thought he had left buried in his past. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw Oliver's serious expression, that same look his father had when he was just a boy in the few photos Thomas had saved. And it wasn't just the physical resemblance. It was Oliver's demeanor. The boy had a quiet, watchful quality about him, a self-reliance that seemed almost unnatural for his age. Thomas remembered his father's stories of growing up alone, of a childhood spent in orphanages and under the care of distant, disinterested relatives. Seeing those same traits in Oliver unsettled him more than he could admit. Unable to resist, Thomas found himself drawn back to St. Mary's just a few days later, under the pretense of checking in on his donation. Mrs. Harper greeted him warmly, visibly grateful to have a benefactor who seemed to care so much. She offered to take him around to see the various improvements they could make now that the funds were secured. As they toured the grounds, Thomas couldn't keep himself from searching for Oliver in every room. Finally, he spotted the boy alone in the courtyard, sitting under a large, spreading oak tree with a small notebook on his lap. He was sketching, his brow furrowed in concentration, and Thomas felt an undeniable pull toward him. "Would you like to meet some of the children?" Mrs. Harper asked, noticing his gaze fixed on the boy. Thomas hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, I would." They walked over to where Oliver sat, and as they approached, the boy looked up, his blue eyes steady and clear, watching them with a curiosity that was neither shy nor forward. He closed his notebook, his fingers still tracing the edges of the cover absent-mindedly as Thomas approached. "Oliver," Mrs. Harper said kindly, "this is Mr. Garrick. He's been very generous to the orphanage." Oliver looked up, tilting his head slightly, studying Thomas with a discerning expression that seemed far older than his years. "Thank you, sir," he said simply, his voice soft but steady. There was no gushing excitement, just a respectful acknowledgement. Thomas smiled, trying to suppress the mix of awe and bewilderment he felt standing before this boy who looked so much like his own father had. "It's good to meet you, Oliver," he replied, his voice gentler than he intended. "What were you working on?" Oliver glanced at his notebook, seeming almost hesitant, before finally holding it out. Thomas took it and flipped through the pages. Inside were sketches, each one precise and well-rendered, drawings of trees, the orphanage, and even a few portraits of the other children. But it was one drawing that made him pause. It was a sketch of the very oak tree they stood under, drawn from an angle that captured its roots, its branches, and even the faint suggestion of an old swing that once hung from one of its limbs. "You're very talented," Thomas murmured, genuinely impressed. "How did you learn to draw like this?" Oliver shrugged, a hint of embarrassment in his expression. "I just practiced, I guess," he replied. "Sometimes, when there's nothing else to do, I draw. I like imagining what things used to look like, even if I wasn't there." Thomas felt a pang of recognition. His father had often sketched in his spare time, though it was something he had kept private, almost like a secret from the world. But here was Oliver, sharing his work openly, albeit with a quiet humility. They talked for a while, Oliver becoming more comfortable as they discussed his sketches and what he liked to draw. Thomas felt a connection growing, each answer revealing another layer of the boy's introspective, observant nature. Mrs. Harper eventually excused herself, leaving the two of them alone under the tree. "Do you know much about your family, Oliver?" Thomas asked, choosing his words carefully. He was aware of the risk in prying, but curiosity gnawed at him. Oliver shook his head. "Not really," he said, looking down. "Mrs. Harper told me I was left here when I was a baby. They don't know who my parents are." A strange mixture of sadness and intrigue washed over Thomas. His mind raced with questions, each one seeming to unravel some invisible thread. Had his father, or perhaps even his grandfather, left behind a family member that he never knew about? It sounded improbable, yet something deep within him refused to dismiss the idea. It was as if the universe had brought him here, to this place, to this boy, to make him confront the history he had never questioned before. "Well, you seem to be doing just fine," Thomas said, offering a smile. "You're quite resilient." Oliver nodded, the barest hint of a smile touching his lips. "I like it here. The other kids are nice, and Mrs. Harper takes good care of us." He paused, then looked up at Thomas with that same piercing gaze. "But sometimes, I wonder what it would be like to have a family." Thomas felt a tightening in his chest, and for a moment, he was silent, unsure of how to respond. In all his years, he had never considered adopting, had never thought of himself as someone who could care for another human being beyond financial provision. And yet, here he was, feeling a connection to a child who shared nothing with him but a peculiar resemblance to his past. "You know, family can come in all forms," Thomas said finally, his voice soft. "Sometimes, it's the people we find later in life who mean the most to us." Oliver considered this, nodding slowly. "I think that's true. Mrs. Harper always says we're like a family here, even if we don't share the same blood." Thomas smiled, the boy's words settling something within him. "That's very wise of her. And she's right." They continued talking, Thomas occasionally glancing around, realizing just how little he had known about the world these children inhabited. The orphanage was clean and orderly, but it lacked so much: new books, enough games, fresh paint on the walls. He could provide all that, of course, but he began to realize that these material offerings were nothing compared to the sense of belonging that Oliver seemed to crave. As their conversation drew to a close, Thomas felt a strange reluctance to leave. Before he knew it, he found himself asking, "Oliver, would you mind if I visited again sometime?" The boy's face lit up in a shy smile, nodding. "That would be nice," he replied. And for the first time, Thomas saw a glimmer of genuine happiness in those blue eyes. As Thomas walked back to his car, he felt an ache in his chest, an unfamiliar but welcome sense of purpose beginning to fill the emptiness that had haunted him for so long. There was something about Oliver, a mystery that seemed intertwined with his own past, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. By the time he reached his car, he had made a decision, one that surprised even him. He would return to St. Mary's again, and not just once. There were questions here, questions that demanded answers, not only for his sake, but for Oliver's. And he had a sense, a feeling that was both unsettling and thrilling, that his life was about to change in ways he could never have predicted. The days after his second visit to St. Mary's were marked by an unshakable preoccupation with Oliver. Thomas couldn't explain the depth of his fixation, but the boy's uncanny resemblance to his father haunted his every thought. The small gestures, the expressions, and even the way Oliver spoke carried traces of a family legacy that Thomas had long tried to forget. The connection felt real, too real to be a mere coincidence. Late one evening, unable to sleep, Thomas found himself rummaging through the old storage room of his estate. Dust covered the boxes piled haphazardly against the walls, remnants of a life filled with possessions he rarely thought about. After what seemed like hours of searching, he finally uncovered a small, weathered box labeled Family Photos. He opened it carefully, as if he were handling something fragile. Inside were old black and white photos of his father as a boy, carefully preserved by his mother before she had passed. The image that gripped him the most was one of his father at the age of 9, standing by a lake with the same serious expression that Thomas had seen on Oliver's face just days ago. The resemblance was shocking. Even the shape of the boy's eyes, the slight downturn of his lips. Oliver could have been his father's twin at that age. Thomas sank into a chair, staring at the photograph. How could a child from an orphanage, one with no known ties to his family, look so much like his father? Could it be that Oliver was somehow connected to him, tied to a piece of his family's past that had long been buried? Questions swirled in his mind, but the most pressing one stood out like a beacon. Who were Oliver's parents? The boy had arrived at St. Mary's with no background, no information about his family. He had simply appeared, just like Thomas's father had appeared in the world of privilege, having come from nothing. Thomas's thoughts raced, considering the possibilities. Could Oliver's ancestry be linked to a long-lost relative? Or was this resemblance a cruel trick of fate, playing on his emotions at a vulnerable time in his life? Unable to sit idle any longer, Thomas decided to investigate. He reached for his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. The man on the other end answered in a gravelly voice, though the tone softened when he recognized Thomas's name. "Thomas Garrick. It's been a long time," the man said. "What can I do for you?" "I need your help, Arthur," Thomas said, pacing the room as he spoke. "There's a boy I need to know more about. He's at St. Mary's Orphanage. His name is Oliver. I want to know everything you can find about his past, his family, how he ended up there." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Arthur responded. "You're looking into an orphan's background? This is unusual, even for you, Thomas." Thomas sighed, already feeling the weight of his decision. "I know it sounds strange, but there's something about this boy. He looks exactly like my father did as a child. I need to know if there's a connection I've overlooked." Arthur, an investigator Thomas had used during his business years, didn't ask any further questions. He had been through enough strange requests from Thomas over the years to know that if Thomas was calling, it was serious. "I'll see what I can dig up," Arthur replied. "Give me a few days." "Thank you, Arthur," Thomas said, hanging up the phone, feeling a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. He had never let himself dwell on family mysteries before. But Oliver's presence had awakened something long dormant in him, an urge to understand the parts of his family history that had always remained out of reach. The days dragged by in anticipation of Arthur's findings. Thomas returned to St. Mary's several times under the pretense of checking on his donation, but in truth, he was drawn there solely to see Oliver. Each time they met, the boy's quiet demeanor and watchful eyes stirred something deeper in Thomas. They spoke often, discussing mundane things like school, books, and Oliver's art. The more they talked, the more Thomas saw shades of his father in the boy. His cautious nature, his introspective personality. One afternoon, as they sat under the oak tree in the courtyard, Oliver opened up in a way he hadn't before. "Sometimes I wonder if my real family is out there, somewhere," Oliver said softly, tracing a pattern in the dirt with a stick. "I dream about them sometimes, even though I don't know who they are. I imagine what they'd be like. Maybe they're looking for me too." Thomas's heart tightened at the boy's words. The thought of Oliver's parents, whoever they were, abandoning such a thoughtful and talented child weighed heavily on him. But it was also a reminder that the mystery of Oliver's origins was one that Thomas had to solve, for both their sakes. Just as Thomas was about to respond, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from Arthur. "I have something. Meet me tonight." Thomas's pulse quickened as he read the text. The moment of truth was fast approaching, and with it, the possibility that the boy in front of him was connected to his family in ways he never imagined. That evening, Thomas sat in a dimly lit restaurant, his nerves on edge as he waited for Arthur. When the investigator finally arrived, he slid into the seat across from Thomas without ceremony, a thin folder clutched in his hand. "I found something," Arthur said, pushing the folder toward Thomas. "It's not much, but it might explain a few things." Thomas opened the folder slowly, his eyes scanning the contents. Inside were sparse documents, mostly routine papers from the orphanage, medical records, admission forms. But one document stood out. It was a police report dated nearly 8 years ago, the night Oliver had been left on St. Mary's doorstep. The report described a woman, unnamed and untraceable, who had been seen near the orphanage the night Oliver was found. Witnesses had reported a frail woman carrying a bundle, leaving it at the gate before disappearing into the night. The police had never been able to identify her, and she had never returned. But what caught Thomas's attention was a small photograph paper-clipped to the report. It was a grainy image taken from a nearby security camera, showing the woman from behind as she hurried away. Though her face wasn't visible, something about the image felt hauntingly familiar to Thomas. The shape of her shoulders, the tilt of her head. It stirred a memory deep within him, one he couldn't place. "There's something else," Arthur said. Reaching into his coat pocket, he pulled out a small envelope and handed it to Thomas. "This was found with the boy when they took him in. It might be a clue." Thomas opened the envelope carefully, revealing a small, tarnished locket. His breath caught in his throat as he recognized the design immediately. It was identical to one his own father had once owned. He had seen it in old family portraits, passed down from generation to generation. It was unmistakably a Garrick family heirloom. The room seemed to close in around him as he stared at the locket, his mind reeling. How could a boy abandoned at an orphanage be wearing something that belonged to his family? Thomas's hands trembled as he turned the locket over, finding a small engraving on the back. It was faint, but legible, "For my beloved son." His heart pounded in his chest. The mystery was no longer just a strange coincidence. It was something far deeper, something that touched the very core of his family's past. But how had this locket ended up with Oliver? And what did it mean about the boy's connection to him? Staring at the small piece of jewelry, Thomas knew that the answers he sought were closer than ever. But with each new revelation came more questions. Questions that threatened to unravel everything he thought he knew about his family and himself. As he sat there, the weight of the truth pressed heavily upon him. He wasn't just chasing a mystery anymore. He was chasing his own history, a legacy that had somehow found its way into the hands of a boy who could very well be part of the Garrick family. And he was determined to find out how. The realization that the locket once belonged to his family weighed heavily on Thomas's mind, lingering like a specter he couldn't shake. It was impossible to look at Oliver the same way after that revelation. The boy wasn't just an orphan who happened to resemble his father. He was someone connected to the heart of Thomas's lineage, a link that Thomas was determined to understand, no matter where it led. Thomas returned to the orphanage the next day, the locket hidden safely in his pocket. This time, his visit was cloaked in a somber resolve, his mind occupied with questions he hoped Mrs. Harper could help him answer. If anyone knew more about Oliver's arrival, it would be her. Mrs. Harper met him at the door with her usual warmth, her face lighting up in a gentle smile. "Mr. Garrick, what a lovely surprise to see you again so soon." "Thank you, Mrs. Harper," he replied, trying to mask the urgency in his voice. "Actually, I came with some questions about Oliver's history. I found a few things recently that raised some unexpected questions." Mrs. Harper's brow furrowed as she led him into her modest office, decorated with soft pastel colors and framed photographs of the children, each one carefully labeled with their names and ages. She gestured for him to sit, settling into her chair with an air of both curiosity and concern. "I'll help in any way I can, Mr. Garrick. What is it you'd like to know?" she asked. Thomas took a steadying breath, his mind racing as he tried to form his question. When Oliver arrived here, was there any mention of his family? Anything at all that might explain who left him here or why? Mrs. Harper leaned back, folding her hands in her lap thoughtfully. "Unfortunately, there wasn't much information. As you may know, Oliver was left on our doorstep in the middle of the night. No identification, No birth certificate, just that locket he carried with him. The police investigated, but nothing ever came of it. Thomas nodded, his hand slipping into his pocket, fingers brushing against the cold metal of the locket. He debated whether to show it to her, but the need for answers outweighed his caution. "I have something here that belonged to my family," he began, pulling the locket out and holding it up. Mrs. Harper's eyes widened slightly as she recognized it. "Yes, that's Oliver's," she said softly, a touch of sadness in her voice. He would clutch it so tightly as a little boy, especially at night when he couldn't sleep. It seemed to bring him comfort, even though he had no idea where it came from. Thomas felt his chest tighten. The image of young Oliver, holding onto the locket like a lifeline, filling him with an overwhelming sense of responsibility. "This locket, it's a family heirloom. My father had one exactly like it, passed down through generations. There's a strong possibility that that he's connected to my family." Mrs. Harper's expression softened as she looked at him, understanding dawning in her eyes. "Are you saying that Oliver might be related to you?" Thomas nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "I believe so, yes. I can't explain how it's possible, but I need to know more. I feel responsible for him, in a way I can't ignore." Mrs. Harper reached across her desk, placing a gentle hand on his. "It sounds like this journey means a great deal to you, Mr. Garrick. Oliver has always yearned for a family, for roots. If there's even a chance that you could be that family, it would mean the world to him." They sat in silence for a moment, each weighed down by the enormity of the possibility. Finally, Mrs. Harper spoke again, her voice filled with quiet resolve. "If you're willing, Mr. Garrick, we could arrange a private meeting. I'll speak with Oliver about it, and if he's comfortable, perhaps you could share this part of his history with him. Maybe it will help him find the answers he's always wanted." Thomas agreed, thanking her with a sincerity that ran deeper than words. As he left the orphanage, he couldn't shake the sense that he was about to unlock a truth not only about Oliver but also about his own past. A truth that had been hidden from him, just waiting to resurface. That evening, Thomas couldn't sleep. He sat by his fireplace, gazing into the flames, the crackling logs providing a comforting backdrop as he sorted through the fragments of his family history in his mind. His father had been a secretive man, often keeping the details of his past shrouded in mystery. There were gaps Thomas had never questioned, threads of stories left untold. Could it be that somewhere in his father's past lay the answer to Oliver's origins? In the quiet hours, an idea took shape, a memory that felt oddly significant now. Decades ago, his father had once mentioned an estranged sibling, a sister who had disappeared under unclear circumstances. Thomas's father had spoken of her only once, describing her as a wild spirit who had left the family behind. After that, she was never mentioned again, as if her existence had been erased. Could she be the missing link that connected him to Oliver? With this new possibility burning in his mind, Thomas picked up his phone and called Arthur once more. The investigator answered quickly, his voice carrying a hint of weariness but also readiness. "Arthur, I need you to investigate something else," Thomas said, his voice steady but intense. "My father's sister, her name was Evelyn. She disappeared from our lives long ago, but I need you to find out what happened to her. I have reason to believe she may have had a child, or even a grandchild." Arthur didn't hesitate. "Consider it done. I'll look into any records I can find, and I'll let you know if I come across anything that could explain this connection." Thanking Arthur, Thomas hung up, his heart pounding with a strange mixture of fear and hope. He had spent years feeling estranged from his own family history, dismissing it as irrelevant, focusing solely on his empire. But now, with Oliver's fate inexplicably intertwined with his own, he felt compelled to dig deeper. Days later, Thomas's phone rang. It was Arthur. "I've got something," Arthur said, his tone grave. "But it's complicated." "Go on," Thomas replied, bracing himself. Arthur took a steadying breath before speaking. "I found records indicating that your father's sister, Evelyn, did indeed have a child. A boy, named Henry. She raised him alone after leaving her family, keeping her distance from the Garrick name. The records show that she lived quietly, working as a painter, never reaching out to anyone. Henry grew up estranged from your family, and sadly, He passed away young. But here's where it gets complicated. Henry had a son, and his name was Oliver. Thomas's heart raced, the truth settling over him with the weight of inevitability. Oliver was not only connected to him, he was his own blood, his great-nephew, Evelyn's grandson. Oliver is part of the Garrick family, Thomas murmured, the words feeling both foreign and exhilarating. Arthur continued, his tone softening. It appears that Evelyn wanted to keep her son and grandson far from the Garrick fortune, perhaps out of pride or a desire to protect them. When Henry passed away, Evelyn tried to raise Oliver on her own. But as her health declined, she must have made the difficult decision to leave him at the orphanage, knowing she couldn't care for him. Thomas was silent, overwhelmed by the truth he had uncovered. He felt a wave of conflicting emotions, grief for the family he had never known, admiration for Evelyn's resilience, and, most profoundly, a fierce protectiveness for Oliver, his only living family. He thanked Arthur and ended the call, his mind whirling with the enormity of what he had discovered. Oliver wasn't just a mysterious boy with a family resemblance. He was a Garrick, a descendant of the very family legacy Thomas had always believed would end with him. The next day, Thomas returned to St. Mary's, feeling a strange mix of hope and trepidation. He found Mrs. Harper, and after a brief conversation, she nodded, understanding the gravity of what he was about to share. Together, they brought Oliver into a small, quiet room, where Thomas sat down across from him, the locket lying on the table between them. Oliver, Thomas began, his voice warm but serious. I've come to learn something important about you, something I believe you deserve to know. Oliver looked at him with wide eyes, a flicker of apprehension crossing his face. But Thomas continued, carefully explaining his investigation, telling Oliver about his own family, about Evelyn, and about the lineage they shared. The boy listened in stunned silence, his expression a mixture of wonder and disbelief. Finally, Thomas held out the locket, letting Oliver take it in his hands. This locket belonged to your grandmother, Evelyn. She was my father's sister, which makes you my family, Oliver. You're a Garrick, just as much as I am. A moment of silence stretched between them, thick with emotion. Then, with a trembling smile, Oliver spoke, his voice barely a whisper. I have a family. Thomas nodded, reaching out to hold the boy's hand in his own. Yes, Oliver, you have a family. And from now on, I promise, you'll never have to wonder about that again. In that moment, Thomas felt a sense of fulfillment he had never known. He had not only found a family member, he had found the future of his family, a legacy that would carry on in Oliver, the last heir to the Garrick name. And with that knowledge came a newfound purpose, one that would shape both of their lives in ways he had yet to imagine. Thomas returned to his estate that evening with Oliver by his side, a feeling of fulfillment and clarity settling over him like never before. For years, he had wandered through life, amassing wealth but never a purpose, and now, with Oliver, he finally felt that his family's legacy had taken on real meaning. Oliver's expression was one of awe as they drove up the winding road leading to the grand estate, his wide eyes drinking in the vastness of the grounds, the carefully manicured lawns, and the sprawling mansion that Thomas had once seen only as a symbol of his own success. Is this where you live?" Oliver asked quietly, still clutching the locket that had revealed his true heritage. Thomas smiled, nodding. "Yes, Oliver. And now, it's yours too. This home, this family, it's all part of who you are." Inside, the house staff greeted them, surprised but welcoming as Thomas introduced Oliver. Mrs. Fletcher, the housekeeper who had served the Garrick family for decades, was especially touched. She looked at the boy with a mixture of warmth and tenderness, her face softening as she addressed Thomas. "He looks just like your father did as a boy," she murmured, blinking back tears. "This house hasn't felt like a home in years, Mr. Garrick. Perhaps young Oliver here is exactly what we all needed." Thomas's heart swelled with pride and an unexpected surge of emotion. He had been so focused on the responsibilities that came with the Garrick name that he hadn't truly allowed himself to feel the joy of gaining a family. That evening, they sat down to dinner, just the two of them, in the grand dining room that once felt hollow but now held a comforting warmth. As they ate, Thomas couldn't help but ask Oliver more about his life before the orphanage, curious to piece together the journey that had brought the boy into his world. "What do you remember about your grandmother, Evelyn?" Thomas asked, his voice gentle. Oliver thought for a moment, his brows knitting as he tried to remember. "She was kind," he said, his voice soft. "She used to paint pictures for me, landscapes and animals. Sometimes she would tell me stories about a big, beautiful house by a lake. I think it was this one," he added, glancing around the grand room. "She told me it belonged to our family, but I thought she was just making it up." Thomas felt a lump form in his throat. Evelyn, his father's sister, had indeed been a talented artist, painting scenes of her family's estate even after she'd left it behind. She had kept the family alive for Oliver in small, beautiful ways, even as she tried to protect him from the legacy she had abandoned. "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman," Thomas replied, his voice filled with respect. "She may have left this life behind, but I think she wanted you to know that you always had a place here." Oliver's eyes shone with wonder as he listened. For him, the pieces of his fragmented past were finally falling into place. But Thomas noticed the boy's gaze drifting occasionally, his expression thoughtful, as if there were still questions left unanswered. "Is something on your mind?" Thomas asked, sensing the boy's hesitation. Oliver looked down, fiddling with the locket in his hand. I wonder why she left this life behind." She never explained, but sometimes she would look out the window and tell me I was safe where we were. "Do you know why she didn't want to be here?" Thomas nodded, realizing that Oliver had likely sensed more than Evelyn had intended. Evelyn was fiercely independent. She didn't want to rely on anyone, especially not on a family fortune. She was proud and wanted to make her own way in the world. But, I think, she also wanted to protect you. She felt that if she raised you away from the Garrick name, you'd have a simpler, safer life. Oliver considered this, nodding slowly as he seemed to grasp his grandmother's motives. "So she kept me away because she thought it would be better for me?" "Yes," Thomas replied, his voice firm but filled with understanding. "Evelyn had her reasons. But now you're here, and I believe she would want you to feel free to embrace this life, however much or little of it you choose." The following weeks were a whirlwind of adjustments and new beginnings for both Thomas and Oliver. Thomas introduced Oliver to the different parts of his world: the grand estate, the sprawling gardens, the library filled with books from every era. Oliver's fascination grew with each discovery, his excitement like a balm that healed something deep within Thomas. Thomas spent his mornings teaching Oliver about the family legacy, showing him family portraits and journals, sharing stories of his own childhood and the many lessons his father had imparted to him. In the afternoons, they explored the grounds together, with Oliver eager to learn and Thomas rediscovering the beauty of his home through the boy's fresh eyes. But there were challenges too, moments of adjustment where the vast gap between their pasts became evident. Oliver, despite his connection to the Garrick lineage, was still a child of humble beginnings. He wasn't used to the grandeur of his new life, and Thomas could see that the luxury often made him uncomfortable. When offered fine clothes or expensive toys, Oliver hesitated, his humility holding him back. Thomas respected this, allowing Oliver to find his own balance and choose what he felt comfortable embracing. One evening, as they sat together on the terrace overlooking the lake, Oliver spoke up, his voice hesitant. "I don't know if I can be the kind of Garrick you want me to be. I've never known what it's like to be part of a family like this, or to have so much. It feels strange." Thomas placed a reassuring hand on Oliver's shoulder. "Oliver, I don't want you to be anything other than yourself. Being a Garrick doesn't mean living a certain way or fitting into a mold. It means carrying forward what matters most: honor, kindness, and the courage to be true to yourself. You've already shown you have those qualities in spades." Oliver looked up, his face relaxing into a shy smile. "Thank you, Uncle Thomas," he murmured, the title sounding both unfamiliar and wonderful on his lips. As the days turned into weeks, Thomas and Oliver grew closer, their relationship blossoming into one that was both fatherly and friendly. Thomas hadn't anticipated how much he would come to care for Oliver, nor how much the boy would fill the long-ignored emptiness within him. The mansion, once so grand yet devoid of warmth, now felt alive, filled with the echoes of laughter and conversations that had been absent for far too long. And as Oliver grew more comfortable, Thomas began to see hints of his father in the boy. Oliver's thoughtfulness, his determination, his instinct to protect those he cared about. It was as if the legacy Thomas had feared would end with him had found new life in Oliver, in ways he hadn't expected. One sunny afternoon, Oliver approached Thomas with a tentative smile, holding out a folded piece of paper. "I made something for you," he said, his eyes bright with excitement. Thomas took the paper and unfolded it, revealing a carefully drawn sketch of the mansion, the trees, and the lake beyond. It was detailed, capturing the beauty of the estate in a way only someone who truly understood it could. Thomas felt his heart swell as he looked at the drawing, marveling at the boy's talent. "This is beautiful, Oliver," he said, his voice filled with pride. "You have a real gift. You're a true artist, just like your grandmother." Oliver's face lit up with pride, and Thomas realized in that moment just how much this boy had changed his life. Through Oliver, he had found a reason to care again, to love and to believe in the power of family. And in turn, Oliver had found the family he had always longed for, one that would cherish and support him as he grew. That night, as they sat by the fire, Thomas shared a story about his own father, a story of hard work, sacrifice, and the strength of family bonds. And as Oliver listened, he leaned his head against Thomas's shoulder, feeling, perhaps for the first time, a true sense of belonging. In the weeks that followed, they settled into a new routine, one built on trust, laughter, and a shared love of family. They had each found something in the other they hadn't known they were missing, something neither money nor success could buy. As Thomas watched Oliver drift off to sleep that night, he felt a profound sense of peace. The boy beside him was his family, his legacy, and in him, Thomas had finally found the purpose and joy he had longed for his entire life. With each passing day, the bond between Thomas and Oliver deepened. Where once the mansion had echoed with emptiness, it now pulsed with the warmth and laughter of shared stories and new memories. Thomas had transformed in ways he hadn't anticipated, learning to set aside his strict routines and embrace a more joyful, carefree approach to life. And Oliver, once quiet and reserved, was beginning to blossom, his shy demeanor giving way to confidence as he found security in his newfound home. One morning, Thomas awoke to find Oliver waiting eagerly by his study with a proposal. "I'd like to paint something for the house," Oliver announced, his eyes shining with excitement. "Something big, to hang in the hallway." Thomas smiled, already envisioning how the house's sterile, grand hallways would come alive with a piece of Oliver's art. "I think that's a wonderful idea," he replied, nodding. "What do you have in mind?" Oliver thought for a moment, then responded, "A picture of us together, our family. I want it to capture everything that matters." The words touched Thomas deeply. They spent the morning discussing ideas, and before long, Oliver was setting up an easel in one of the unused rooms, the sunlight spilling in through the tall windows and illuminating the blank canvas. He sketched out a scene of the estate, with Thomas and Oliver standing at the forefront, a representation of the life they were building together. Thomas would often slip into the room while Oliver worked, watching with awe as the boy poured his soul into each brushstroke. Days turned into weeks, and as Oliver worked on the painting, Thomas found himself becoming more deeply involved in the boy's life. He took Oliver under his wing, teaching him not only about the Garrick legacy, but also about the world outside the mansion. They went on day trips to museums, where Oliver's face would light up at the sight of great masterpieces, and to the bustling city, where he watched with fascination the lives of those who lived far differently than he had at the orphanage. One evening, after an outing to an art exhibit, Oliver grew unusually quiet on the drive home. Thomas glanced over, sensing something was weighing on him. "Is everything all right, Oliver?" he asked gently. Oliver looked down at his hands, a touch of nervousness in his expression. I'm so grateful for all of this," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Sometimes I wonder why you chose me." Thomas pulled over, turning to face him. "I didn't choose you, Oliver. We found each other. And I think, deep down, we were always meant to. You're my family, and I wouldn't trade that for anything." A tear slipped down Oliver's cheek, but he quickly wiped it away, nodding. "Thank you," he whispered, his face breaking into a shy smile. "I'm really happy here." They drove back in silence, but the connection between them felt stronger than ever. When they returned to the mansion, Thomas was surprised to find his attorney, Mr. Daly, waiting in the foyer with a file in hand. Though they had spoken briefly after Thomas made his donation to the orphanage, he hadn't expected to see him tonight. "Good evening, Mr. Garrick," Mr. Daly greeted him, his tone respectful but urgent. "I apologize for dropping by unannounced, but there's something important I need to discuss with you regarding your estate plans." Thomas exchanged a look with Oliver, then nodded, motioning for Mr. Daly to follow him into his study. Once they were seated, Mr. Daly wasted no time, laying out a series of legal documents on the table. "Thomas," he began, his tone more familiar now that they were alone, "it's about the changes you've been wanting to make. The inheritance laws are clear, but because Oliver is an adopted heir and not born into the family, some additional provisions need to be made if he is to inherit the Garrick estate." Thomas's heart sank, realizing the implications of what Mr. Daly was saying. Despite his deepening bond with Oliver, the law viewed him as a separate entity, an outsider to the Garrick lineage. If anything were to happen to Thomas, there would be challenges to Oliver's right to inherit the estate. It was a reality that clashed sharply with the newfound sense of family they had built together. Mr. Daly continued, his voice steady but cautious. "I would suggest an adoption, an official, legal adoption. That would solidify Oliver's rights and protect him from any challenges that might arise in the future." The suggestion left Thomas thoughtful, a surge of emotions running through him. Adopting Oliver officially meant solidifying their bond in a way that transcended blood, and it would ensure that Oliver's place in his life and his legacy would be protected. But it was also a weighty decision, one that carried a permanence he hadn't fully considered until now. When Mr. Daly left, Thomas found Oliver in the art room, putting the finishing touches on the painting they had dreamed up together. The scene was breathtaking, a portrait of the mansion and its grounds bathed in golden light, with Thomas and Oliver side by side. In that moment, he knew the decision he needed to make. Taking a deep breath, he approached Oliver, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Oliver, I have something I'd like to ask you," he said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. Oliver turned to face him, curiosity evident in his eyes. "What is it, Uncle Thomas?" Thomas knelt down to Oliver's level, meeting his gaze directly. "Would you allow me to officially adopt you? To make you, in every sense of the word, a Garrick?" Oliver's eyes widened, and for a moment, he seemed too stunned to speak. Then, slowly, a radiant smile spread across his face, one that was filled with hope and joy. "Really?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "You'd want me as your son?" "More than anything," Thomas replied, his voice thick with emotion. "You've brought so much into my life, Oliver. I want you to have the future you deserve, a future with a family that's here for you, always." Tears filled Oliver's eyes as he threw his arms around Thomas, hugging him tightly. "Yes," he murmured, his voice filled with wonder. "Yes, I'd love that." In the days that followed, the mansion was filled with preparations for the formal adoption. Paperwork was signed, meetings were held, and before long, the day of the official adoption ceremony arrived. Oliver dressed in a suit that Mrs. Fletcher had helped him pick out, standing proudly beside Thomas as they both signed the final documents, binding them together as father and son. The celebration afterward was intimate yet joyous, with Mrs. Fletcher and the household staff joining in to mark the occasion. Thomas felt a renewed sense of purpose as he looked at Oliver, now legally and officially his son. The boy's joy was infectious, and Thomas knew that in adopting Oliver, he hadn't only given the boy a home. He had also found a second chance at a life he had longed for but never truly understood. Their lives settled into a rhythm, the bond between them growing deeper as they embraced their new roles as father and son. Thomas introduced Oliver to the responsibilities he would one day inherit, teaching him about the family business, the importance of integrity, and the values he wanted to pass down. Oliver absorbed it all eagerly, asking questions and sharing ideas with a sharpness that impressed Thomas. He was a Garrick in every way, not only by law but in spirit. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Oliver looked up at Thomas, a question in his eyes. "Do you think I'll be ready someday? To take over everything?" Thomas smiled, reaching out to ruffle his hair affectionately. "You're already showing the qualities you need, Oliver. It's not about wealth or power. It's about having the courage to make difficult choices, to be fair, and to lead with kindness. You'll be more than ready." Oliver nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I think I understand now. It's about taking care of the people who depend on you, isn't it?" Thomas's heart swelled with pride. "Exactly, my son. And that's why I know you'll do just fine." As the fire crackled, Thomas felt a profound sense of peace wash over him. He had finally found the family he had unknowingly searched for all his life. Oliver, his son, was his legacy, his heart, and his future. Together, they had transformed the Garrick name into something meaningful, a symbol not just of wealth, but of love, resilience, and a bond that transcended the boundaries of blood. And as they sat together, watching the flames dance, Thomas knew with certainty that his legacy was in the best hands possible, those of his beloved son, Oliver Garrick. The weeks following the adoption felt like a dream. The mansion was alive with a renewed sense of purpose, and Thomas found joy in sharing his world with Oliver, guiding him through family traditions, introducing him to old friends, and showing him the importance of using their influence responsibly. For Thomas, every day was a new beginning, a life infused with the warmth and love he had never anticipated. Yet, as they grew closer, Thomas sensed there were still lingering questions in Oliver's mind. Though the boy had embraced his new life with wonder and enthusiasm, there were moments when he grew quiet, looking at old family portraits or sitting by the lake, lost in thought. Thomas understood that while he had answered many of Oliver's questions, there were parts of their shared history, painful parts, that he had kept hidden. One crisp autumn afternoon, they were walking through the gardens, the leaves crunching underfoot and the air cool and sharp with the scent of fall. Oliver was quiet, gazing up at the massive trees that had stood on the Garrick estate for generations. After a long silence, Oliver spoke, his voice hesitant. "Uncle Thomas, I mean Dad," he corrected himself, a small smile playing on his lips. "Can I ask you something? Something about the family?" Thomas nodded, sensing the weight of Oliver's question. "Of course, son. You can ask me anything." Oliver stopped walking, looking down at his hands. "Why did Grandma Evelyn leave the family?" he asked, his tone soft yet filled with genuine curiosity. "I know she wanted to protect me, but was there more to it?" Thomas felt a pang in his chest, the question touching on a part of their history he had always struggled to face. Evelyn had left the Garrick name behind, turning her back on a life of privilege and prosperity, and she had done so without a word. Only now, with Oliver here, did Thomas realize how much of her story had gone untold. "Evelyn and I were close when we were young," he began, his voice soft as they continued walking. "But she was different from the rest of us. She never cared much for wealth or status. To her, happiness didn't come from money or power. She wanted a life filled with purpose, something she could shape on her own." Oliver nodded, listening intently as they strolled along the garden path. Thomas continued, a bittersweet smile playing on his lips. "Evelyn's decision to leave hurt my father deeply. He was a man who valued family legacy above all else, and he saw her choice as a betrayal. For years, they didn't speak. She left quietly, without telling me where she was going. I respected her decision, even though I missed her." The wind rustled the leaves around them, and Oliver looked up at Thomas, his expression both thoughtful and pained. "I wish I could have met her. I think we would have understood each other." Thomas's heart softened as he placed a comforting hand on Oliver's shoulder. "I think she would have loved you, Oliver. She would be so proud to know that you found a family here." They walked in silence, the weight of Evelyn's story settling over them. But as they approached the mansion, a figure appeared at the gate. A young woman with an anxious expression, clutching a small notebook against her chest. She looked to be in her late 20s, with dark hair and intense, searching eyes that flickered between Thomas and Oliver. "Excuse me," she called, her voice hesitant. "I'm sorry to intrude. My name is Clara Morgan. I believe you've been looking for answers about Evelyn Garrick." Thomas felt a shock course through him, and he instinctively shielded Oliver as he approached her. "How do you know Evelyn?" he asked cautiously. Clara nodded, her expression somber. "Evelyn was my grandmother. I was raised by her after my parents passed away. I knew she had a grandson, but I didn't know who or where he was until recently. I've been doing some research on the family, and I came across your name." Thomas glanced back at Oliver, who was watching Clara with wide eyes. The sudden appearance of another family member was as much a shock to him as it was to Thomas, and he struggled to process this new information. Slowly, Clara stepped forward, holding out the notebook. "This belonged to Evelyn," she said, her voice steady yet filled with emotion. She kept a journal, notes, sketches, memories. She wrote about the Garrick family, about the home she left behind, and most importantly, about her grandson Oliver. She was a complicated woman, but she loved him deeply. She wanted him to know his heritage, even if she couldn't be there to tell him herself. Thomas reached for the notebook with trembling hands, glancing at Oliver, who nodded in encouragement. As he opened the worn pages, he was greeted by sketches of the Garrick estate. Its towering trees, the lake, even the mansion's facade. Her handwriting filled the pages, each word brimming with emotion, describing the life she had left and the life she had hoped for her grandson. Flipping through, Thomas found a passage that caught his attention. "To my grandson Oliver, who carries the spirit of the Garricks. I left you with strangers, but I did it with a heavy heart and a deep love. I wanted you to be safe, free from the burdens that weighed me down. I hope that someday you'll understand my choices and that you'll find a place to call home, a place where you are loved and cherished." Reading the words, Thomas felt tears prick at his eyes. He had only recently discovered Oliver's connection to the Garrick family, but here was Evelyn's own message, guiding her grandson to the very family she had left behind. Clara watched him, her eyes filled with understanding. She always hoped Oliver would be part of a family, one that would accept him without question. She carried that hope with her until the very end. Thomas closed the notebook, looking over at Oliver, who seemed equally moved. "She loved you very much," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "And she left these words so that you would know. No matter where she was, you were always in her heart." They invited Clara into the house, where she shared more stories of Evelyn's life and the years she had spent raising Oliver's mother. The three of them sat in the living room late into the evening, piecing together the fragments of Evelyn's life, unraveling the threads of a history that had been buried in silence. At one point, Clara reached out and took Oliver's hand. "You're part of something big, Oliver," she said gently. "But the best part is, you have the freedom to choose what that means for you." As the night wore on, Oliver found himself drawn to Clara's stories, filling in the gaps of his family history with vivid detail. For the first time, he felt like he truly understood where he came from, not just a family name, but a legacy shaped by choices, sacrifices, and a fierce love that transcended distance. After Clara left, Thomas and Oliver were left alone, both exhausted yet content, their hearts full. As they prepared for bed, Thomas noticed Oliver lingering by the painting they had worked on together. It now hung proudly in the hallway, depicting the mansion, the lake, and the two of them standing side by side. "Do you think I'm ready for all this?" Oliver asked, his voice a mix of wonder and uncertainty. "Being part of the family, the legacy, everything?" Thomas wrapped an arm around his shoulder, giving him a gentle squeeze. "You are ready, Oliver, and you don't have to do it alone. We'll navigate this together, as a family. Whatever comes our way, we'll face it side by side." Oliver nodded, his gaze steady. "I want to honor her, you know? I want to carry forward what she left behind and make it something meaningful." Thomas's heart swelled with pride. He saw in Oliver not only the family's past but also its future, a future built on the love, resilience, and courage that Evelyn had instilled in him, and that Thomas now had the privilege of guiding. As they headed upstairs, Thomas realized that his search for family had come full circle. He had not only discovered a lineage filled with hidden stories and secrets, but he had also found a son who would carry forward a legacy redefined by love, strength, and the freedom to choose. And for the first time in his life, Thomas felt that the Garrick name truly meant something. A legacy that was no longer a burden, but a testament to the bonds they had forged, bonds that would last for generations. In the weeks after Clara's visit, life at the mansion settled into a peaceful, steady rhythm. Thomas and Oliver spent countless hours in the library, poring over Evelyn's journal, piecing together her life and dreams, honoring the choices she had made to protect her grandson. For Thomas, every entry felt like a window into a past he had misunderstood, and every story Clara shared had revealed a side of his sister he had never truly known. Her selflessness, her courage, and her determination had created the foundation on which Oliver now stood. One chilly afternoon, Thomas and Oliver sat together in the study, Evelyn's journal open before them. Oliver's gaze was intense as he traced his fingers over her words, her sketches of places she had loved, and the thoughts she had left behind. He looked up at Thomas, his blue eyes filled with determination. "I want to do something with all of this," Oliver announced. "Something that would make her proud." Thomas nodded, feeling a surge of pride. "What do you have in mind, son?" Oliver thought for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "I want to transform the orphanage, the place where she left me. I want to make it a place where every child feels safe and loved, just like she wanted for me." His voice grew stronger as he continued, "Maybe it could be a sanctuary, not just an orphanage. A place where kids can learn, be creative, and discover who they are." Thomas felt his heart swell at the idea. "That's a beautiful vision, Oliver," he said. "A legacy built on love and kindness, just like Evelyn would have wanted. I'll help you in every way I can." They spent the next several days planning out Oliver's vision for the orphanage. Together, they met with architects, designers, and charity experts, brainstorming how to turn the aging building into a modern sanctuary for children. The blueprint quickly evolved from basic renovations to a complete transformation. A space with colorful rooms, a library, art studios, and even a garden where the children could plant and tend to their own flowers and vegetables. The orphanage would have dedicated spaces for education, art, and counseling, all designed to foster a sense of community and family, ensuring that every child who walked through its doors would know they were valued and cared for. Oliver was involved in every step, asking questions, providing ideas, and watching his dream take shape with an excitement that reminded Thomas of his own early days in business. It was clear that Oliver was not only invested in the project, he was passionate about creating something beautiful for those who needed it most. Throughout the planning, Oliver spent hours each day at the orphanage, getting to know the children, listening to their stories, and learning about their needs. Mrs. Harper, the orphanage director, watched with admiration as Oliver dedicated himself to making the lives of these children better. And while Thomas had initially accompanied him, he soon found that Oliver was fully capable of handling the interactions on his own. One day, as Oliver returned from a meeting with the orphanage staff, he found Thomas waiting for him in the library, a thoughtful expression on his face. "I heard you spoke with the board members today," Thomas said, smiling. "How did it go?" Oliver beamed, pride shining in his eyes. "It went well. They're all on board with the renovation plan, and they've even suggested turning the upstairs rooms into an art and music space for the kids." Thomas nodded, impressed. "I knew you'd be a natural. You have Evelyn's heart, Oliver, and her strength." Oliver hesitated, then looked at Thomas with a question he had been holding back. "Did you ever imagine your legacy would be this?" he asked, his voice soft but full of curiosity. Thomas shook his head, his expression thoughtful. "I spent most of my life building wealth, thinking that was the legacy I would leave behind. But now, seeing what you're doing, I realize that legacy is more than money or power. It's about the impact you leave on people's lives. I see that now, thanks to you." They sat in comfortable silence, each of them reflecting on the journey that had brought them together. For Thomas, the past months had not only redefined his view of legacy, but they had also reshaped the very essence of who he was. He was no longer just Thomas Garrick, wealthy and powerful. He was a father, a mentor, and now, a true leader of a legacy built on compassion. The renovations on the orphanage began soon after, transforming the building piece by piece. Oliver was on site nearly every day, overseeing the work, learning about construction, and offering ideas for the details that would make the place feel like home. When the garden was planted, he gathered the children, showing them how to dig, plant seeds, and water the soil, encouraging them to think of it as their own project. Soon, vibrant flowers and leafy vegetables filled the space, adding life to the orphanage in ways that went beyond mere structure. One morning, as Thomas was reviewing some business paperwork, he received an unexpected call from Mr. Daly, his lawyer. There was a note of urgency in Mr. Daly's voice that gave him pause. "Mr. Garrick, I have news that concerns the legacy of the estate," Mr. Daly began, choosing his words carefully. "It seems there's an old will, written by your father, that contains certain stipulations about heirs to the Garrick name." Thomas's brow furrowed. "What kind of stipulations?" Mr. Daly hesitated, clearly aware of the sensitivity of the matter. "According to the document, your father wanted to ensure that only direct descendants by blood could inherit the estate and the family business. It seems he was quite traditional in his views." A knot formed in Thomas's stomach. "And how does that affect Oliver?" "Given that Oliver was adopted," Mr. Daly explained, "the terms of the will could complicate his inheritance of the estate. We could challenge it, of course, but it may bring unwanted attention to the family." Thomas felt a surge of anger, not at his father, but at the old, outdated views that threatened to undermine everything he and Oliver had built together. He had finally found peace and purpose in sharing his legacy with his son, and now, an old will stood in their way. After he ended the call, he sat in silence, considering his options. He could contest the will, but that might mean dragging their family's personal matters into the public eye. Or he could honor the terms, which meant finding a way to secure Oliver's place in the Garrick legacy outside of the traditional inheritance. That evening, Thomas shared the news with Oliver, choosing to be transparent about the challenges they faced. "I'm sorry, son," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "My father's old will has some strict conditions, ones that could make it difficult for you to inherit the estate directly." Oliver was quiet, his eyes wide with surprise, but after a moment, he placed a reassuring hand on Thomas's arm. "It's okay, Dad," he said softly. "I don't need the estate. What matters to me is that we're family. That's the real legacy." Thomas felt a rush of pride and gratitude. "Thank you, Oliver. But I want to make sure you're taken care of, no matter what." After a long discussion, they came up with a plan. Thomas would legally restructure his assets, establishing a trust for Oliver that would secure his future without directly challenging the terms of his father's will. The trust would also fund the orphanage and similar charitable ventures, ensuring that Oliver's vision for giving back would continue for generations to come. The next few weeks were spent finalizing the trust, each document a step toward reclaiming a legacy that aligned with their values, rather than outdated conventions. Once everything was in place, Thomas felt a sense of peace, knowing that Oliver's place in the family was protected. On the day the trust was officially signed, they visited the orphanage together, now bustling with activity as the renovations neared completion. The children ran up to Oliver, pulling him toward the new library, excited to show off their favorite books and the cozy reading nooks that had been added. Watching his son interact with the children, Thomas felt a swell of pride. He realized that the Garrick legacy was no longer a burden but a beacon of hope, one that would continue to shine through Oliver's generosity and kindness. As they stood in the garden, surrounded by the laughter of the children, Oliver turned to Thomas, his face filled with contentment. "We did it, Dad," he said, a radiant smile lighting up his face. "We're really making a difference." Thomas put an arm around Oliver, pulling him close. "Yes, we did," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "And this, Oliver, is the true Garrick legacy. Not wealth, not power, but love, kindness, and the courage to create a better world." Together, they stood in the garden, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon, its golden light casting a warm glow over the orphanage. In that moment, Thomas knew that they had reclaimed the legacy in the truest sense. It was a legacy built not on material wealth, but on the strength of a father and son, united by a shared vision for a future that would make Evelyn and generations of Garricks proud. The grand opening of the newly transformed St. Mary's Orphanage arrived on a crisp spring morning, the air alive with the scent of blooming flowers and fresh paint. The orphanage, now fully renovated and rebranded as the Garrick Center for Hope, stood as a beacon of warmth and compassion. The building gleamed with fresh coats of color, welcoming children and visitors alike with vibrant murals, cozy corners, and inviting spaces that radiated the vision Oliver had dreamed of. Oliver, dressed in a suit that Thomas had tailored for him, looked out over the crowd gathered on the lawn. It included members of the orphanage's staff, city officials, the children he had come to know so well, and other benefactors inspired by his vision. At his side, Thomas stood proudly, feeling a swell of pride and love as he looked at his son. This day wasn't just a celebration of a project completed. It was a testament to the love that had grown between them and the future they had built together. Mrs. Harper took to the small stage they had set up, welcoming everyone and sharing a heartfelt speech about the orphanage's transformation. She described how Oliver's leadership and empathy had turned a struggling institution into a place where children would thrive, find joy, and discover hope. "And now," she said, her voice warm, "I'd like to invite the man who made all of this possible. Please welcome Oliver Garrick." Oliver stepped forward, met with applause that grew louder as he made his way up to the podium. He looked out over the crowd, his cheeks flushed but his expression confident. Thomas watched, pride swelling in his chest as he saw how far his son had come. "Thank you, Mrs. Harper," Oliver began, his voice clear. "Thank you to everyone who believed in this vision and helped make it a reality. When I first arrived at St. Mary's, I didn't know where I belonged. I didn't know if I would ever find a family or a place to call home. But because of all of you, I did. And today, I want every child who comes through these doors to know that they, too, belong. This place is for them." The applause was thunderous, but Oliver wasn't finished. He glanced at Thomas, a smile spreading across his face. "And there's one person I especially want to thank, my dad, Thomas Garrick. Without him, none of this would have been possible. He believed in me, and he showed me that family isn't just about blood, but about love, loyalty, and kindness. He gave me the courage to dream big and the strength to make those dreams come true." Thomas felt his eyes well up, the weight of Oliver's words settling over him like a warm embrace. When the applause died down, he joined Oliver on the stage, wrapping his arm around his son as they looked out at the crowd together. After the ceremony, the children led Oliver on a tour of the new spaces, excitedly showing him the library, the art room, and their favorite reading nooks. Thomas stood by, watching as Oliver interacted with each child, laughing, listening, and sharing in their joy. In that moment, Thomas realized that the true inheritance he had passed on to his son wasn't money or property. It was the compassion, courage, and wisdom to change lives for the better. Later, as the guests began to disperse, a familiar figure made her way through the crowd, Clara, Evelyn's granddaughter. She had been a supportive force throughout the renovation, helping Oliver with details and sharing stories of Evelyn that had inspired many of the orphanage's artistic touches. Clara hugged Oliver warmly, congratulating him, her eyes filled with pride. "You did something amazing, Oliver," she said, her voice filled with genuine admiration. "Evelyn would have been so proud of you. She dreamed of giving you a life of freedom, and now you're giving that same gift to so many others." Oliver smiled, nodding. "It feels like everything I hoped for and more," he replied. "It's almost like she's here with us, watching over everything." Clara looked at Thomas, her gaze warm and knowing. "And I think she'd be proud of you too, Mr. Garrick. You've not only honored her memory, but you've given Oliver the family she always wished he'd find." Thomas felt a deep gratitude toward Clara for her words, knowing she, too, had been part of this journey to create a legacy that transcended his own ambitions. He nodded, offering a humble smile. "Thank you, Clara. I think we've all made something together that would make Evelyn proud." That evening, back at the mansion, Thomas and Oliver shared a quiet dinner, both still filled with the emotions of the day. Afterward, they retired to the library, where a fire crackled softly in the hearth. The weight of the journey they had taken together, from strangers to family, lingered in the air between them. Oliver leaned back in his chair, looking thoughtful. "Today was everything I ever hoped for," he said, his voice filled with contentment. "It's strange. I always thought that finding a family would mean finding someone who looked like me, someone who shared my past. But it turns out, the family I found was even better." Thomas chuckled, nodding. And I never thought I'd have the chance to experience this kind of happiness or purpose in my life. You've given me a gift, Oliver, a reason to live that's bigger than myself." They sat in companionable silence, each man lost in his thoughts. Finally, Oliver glanced up, his gaze meeting Thomas's with a mix of affection and determination. "Dad, I want to help the Garrick business someday. I want to keep building on what you started, but I want to make it something that reflects who we are now." Thomas felt a wave of pride at Oliver's words. "You already have a vision, son, and it's a good one. I think together, we can make the business into something that not only reflects our family but helps others the way the Garrick Center for Hope does." In the following months, Oliver's vision took root within the Garrick Company, where he introduced initiatives to invest in community projects, sustainable practices, and educational opportunities for underprivileged youth. It was an ambitious project, but with Thomas's guidance, Oliver's dreams began to transform the family business into a force for good, a legacy of compassion and social responsibility, one that carried the heart of the Garrick family. Every decision Oliver made, every project he launched, echoed the principles Evelyn had instilled in him and that Thomas had come to embrace. The Garrick name, once synonymous only with wealth, was now a beacon of hope for countless people, and as Oliver's impact grew, so did his reputation. In a way, the Garrick legacy had become a tapestry, woven from the dreams of the generations that had come before and the new vision that Oliver brought to the family name. It was a legacy that belonged not only to Thomas and Oliver, but also to Evelyn, whose love and sacrifice had set them on this path. One evening, as they walked through the halls of the mansion, Oliver paused at the painting he had created. The one of him and Thomas standing together in front of the estate, their figures framed by the beauty of the landscape. The painting had become a symbol for both of them, a reminder of the journey they had taken together. "I think this is my favorite part of the mansion," Oliver said, his voice soft but filled with conviction. Thomas looked at the painting, a smile tugging at his lips. "It's mine too," he replied. "It reminds me that, despite everything, we found each other. We created a family that's stronger and more meaningful than anything I could have imagined." As they stood there, surrounded by the quiet of the mansion and the weight of their shared history, Thomas felt an overwhelming sense of peace. He knew that the Garrick legacy would be in good hands, carried forward by Oliver's kindness, strength, and vision. And more importantly, he knew that their bond was unbreakable, a testament to the power of love, family, and redemption. Oliver looked up at his father, his expression filled with gratitude and affection. "Thank you, Dad, for everything. For believing in me, for giving me a place to call home, and for teaching me what it means to be a Garrick." Thomas wrapped an arm around his son's shoulders, pulling him close. "Thank you, Oliver, for giving me a reason to believe again. You're the best thing that ever happened to me." As they stood together, father and son, Thomas knew that the future of the Garrick family was secure, not in the wealth he had built or the power he had accumulated, but in the legacy of love, compassion, and integrity that he and Oliver would continue to share. And as the light of the setting sun bathed them in a warm glow, Thomas felt, for the first time, that the journey of his life was complete, a journey that had led him not to wealth, but to the joy and fulfillment he had always longed for, held in the love of the son who stood beside him. Years passed, and the Garrick name evolved into a symbol of compassion, empowerment, and transformation, thanks to Oliver's vision and Thomas's unwavering support. Together, they had built a family legacy that wasn't based on wealth alone, but on a commitment to change lives, give hope, and inspire others to make a difference. The Garrick Center for Hope became a well-known sanctuary, welcoming children from across the city and giving them a safe place to grow, learn, and dream. Oliver had grown into a man who embodied the strength and wisdom of his father and the resilience of his grandmother, Evelyn. His role in the family business expanded with each passing year, his impact seen not only in financial success but in the charitable projects he championed. Under his leadership, the Garrick Company invested in programs for education, affordable housing, and environmental sustainability, making the business an extension of the Garrick Center's mission. Thomas watched his son's accomplishments with pride, his heart swelling every time he saw Oliver speaking at a charity event, meeting with young scholars, or planting trees at the orphanage. He had long since realized that his purpose in life was not the accumulation of wealth, but the nurturing of a legacy that would outlast them both. A legacy of kindness, love, and purpose. In Oliver, he saw that legacy coming to life. One spring evening, after a day spent working on a new youth program for the Garrick Center, Thomas and Oliver sat together in the study, reminiscing about how far they had come. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, filling the room with warmth as they reflected on the journey that had transformed them from strangers into family. "Do you remember when we first met at the orphanage?" Thomas asked with a smile, his voice filled with nostalgia. Oliver chuckled, nodding. "I remember thinking you looked like a very serious man who probably didn't smile much," he teased. Thomas laughed, shaking his head. "I suppose I didn't, but you changed that. You brought light into my life when I thought it was too late to find any." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, both of them reflecting on the bond they had forged. Then Oliver looked up, a hint of sadness in his eyes. "Dad, I want you to know, no matter what happens, I'll carry on everything you've started. The Garrick Center, the business, the legacy. It means everything to me." Thomas reached out, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "I know, Oliver, and I couldn't be prouder. You've become more than I ever dreamed of. You are my legacy, and I couldn't ask for a better one." In the months that followed, Thomas's health began to decline. It was a gradual process, but both he and Oliver knew that his time was limited. Thomas faced his mortality with peace, knowing that he had lived a life full of purpose, love, and fulfillment. He spent his final days surrounded by the people he loved: Oliver, Clara, Mrs. Fletcher, and the staff who had become like family over the years. One evening, with Oliver sitting beside him, Thomas felt the weight of years lift, replaced by a quiet contentment that came from knowing he had done all he could. He looked at his son, his heart full. "Remember, Oliver," he whispered, his voice weak but steady, "the legacy isn't in the wealth or the name. It's in the love we give, the lives we touch, and the kindness we leave behind. That's what it means to be a Garrick." With those words, Thomas closed his eyes, his hand resting in Oliver's, his final breath filled with peace. The funeral was a private affair, held at the family estate with only close friends, family, and the children from the Garrick Center in attendance. Oliver stood beside his father's casket, surrounded by those who had been touched by Thomas's life. The children sang a song in tribute, their voices lifting into the spring air, a beautiful testament to the man who had given them hope. After the service, Oliver led the guests to the garden that his father had cherished. Under the old oak tree, a plaque was placed in Thomas's honor. "Thomas Garrick, a man of vision, compassion, and endless love. May his legacy live on through the hearts he touched." The months that followed were challenging for Oliver, as he adjusted to life without the man who had become his father, mentor, and closest friend. But he carried Thomas's words in his heart, determined to live up to the legacy his father had entrusted to him. Each day, he poured his energy into the Garrick Center and the family business, ensuring that every decision he made honored the values they had shared. Years later, Oliver stood on the steps of the Garrick Center, now a bustling sanctuary that served not only children but also families in need. The center had expanded, with branches in several cities, each one dedicated to providing support, education, and a sense of community. The Garrick name had become synonymous with kindness and social impact, a legacy of love that had touched thousands of lives. On this day, Oliver was joined by his wife, Clara, and their young daughter, Evelyn, named after the grandmother who had given him his start in life. Holding little Evelyn's hand, he looked out over the crowd gathered to celebrate the opening of the newest wing of the center, dedicated to arts and creative expression, a space he had designed to honor his father's love of art and family. As he spoke to the crowd, Oliver felt a deep sense of gratitude. "This center," he began, his voice filled with emotion, "represents the legacy of my father, Thomas Garrick, who believed that true wealth is measured by the lives we touch and the love we give. It was his dream to create a world where every child, every person, has the chance to find hope, to feel valued, and to know they belong." He paused, glancing down at Evelyn, who looked up at him with wide, admiring eyes. "And it's a dream I intend to carry forward for my children, and for the future." The applause was deafening, and as Oliver looked out over the crowd, he saw countless faces, former orphans, community members, supporters, and volunteers, all part of the legacy his father had left behind. In that moment, Oliver knew that Thomas's dream had been realized in ways neither of them could have imagined. After the ceremony, Oliver took Evelyn's hand, leading her through the garden his father had loved, the place where their family had found its beginning. He stopped under the old oak tree, kneeling down to meet her gaze. "Do you know why we're here, sweetheart?" he asked gently. Evelyn looked around, her little face scrunched in thought. "Is it because Grandpa loved this place?" Oliver smiled, nodding. "Yes, he did. And he taught me something very important here. He taught me that being a Garrick means more than having a big house or a lot of money. It means helping others, showing kindness, and making the world a better place." Evelyn's eyes sparkled with understanding, and she nodded. "I want to be like Grandpa, too." Oliver felt a warmth in his chest, a sense of peace that filled him with hope. "You will be, Evelyn. You already are." They stood together, father and daughter, under the oak tree where so much had begun. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden light over the garden, Oliver felt the presence of his father and grandmother, the generations that had come before, guiding him forward. The legacy of the Garrick family had been redefined, shaped not by wealth alone but by love, integrity, and compassion. It was a legacy that would continue through the generations, a testament to the power of family and the lasting impact of a heart open to love. And as Oliver took Evelyn's hand, he knew that, together, they would carry forward the legacy that Thomas had begun. A legacy not built on inheritance, but on the bonds that bound them together as family.